There's the commercial for the hair club, which obviously I'm not a member, being a completely bald, and the guy who would always finish the commercials with something to the effect of, "I'm not just the president, I'm also a client." And this is a issue that's near and dear to my heart. Not only am I concerned about the talent crunch, I'm having a dickens of a time hiring people. The reason I've come to from Montevallo to Oglethorpe, is to be the dean of a startup business school. The Hammett School of Business is new, so we are trying desperately to staff up. So I assure you, I feel the pain of the talent crunch as much as anybody right now, because it is literally impossible for us to hire at the moment. So I'm feeling this pain very directly. So what I thought I'd do is walk through what I think the outline of the talent crunch is, what seems to be causing it, where are these workers, how does this interact with the state of the economy, and then after that, at the end, open up for questions. How's that sound? Very good. So let's start first by talking about, if you've sort of heard my speaking before, you know that I've will oftentimes try to distinguish between what's real economics and what's politically driven explanations of economics. One of the challenges that I see with our culture generally is that citizens get too much of their economic news through a political lens. So there are a lot of political tropes, ideas. Well, here's what seems to be happening with the great talent crunch, and largely they're political explanations, but they don't bear up to scrutiny in the real economy. So the talent crunch we're facing is not explained by government programs paying people not to work. If you look at what was happening before COVID, we were already in a talent crunch. COVID has only exaggerated it, so it's certainly not that. If you look at the arc of the additional support, there were 22 of the 50 states that ended the enhanced support for unemployment benefits that were driven by COVID-19. And as those ended in those states, it had no appreciable impact on the talent crunch in those states. We've seen the federal programs come to an end. It has not affected the talent crunch. So you can certainly go out and find examples of people who are seizing the moment of having additional unemployment benefits. But in terms of that as a being way to explain the talent crunch, it just doesn't work. You hear people say, well, there are unprecedented numbers of people who are simply discouraged and dropping out of the workforce. Again, this is just not true. If you look at the historic rates of participation rates by adults in the workforce, we are not at an all-time high, but relative to historic rates, we have very high participation in the workforce. Now, part of that is complicated by the fact that the definition that we created, that we use to measure participation, was created in 1946 and has never changed. And it just doesn't reflect the way we live now. So the way that the official participation rate is measured is anyone 16 to death. So anyone who decides to finish high school is lowering the participation rate. Anyone that goes on to college is lowering the participation rate, because if you're 16 or over and not employed full-time, you're not participating. Anyone who retires, which some of you may have done, I suspect, if you are lowering the participation rate by not working until the day you drop dead. That's the way that works. So that definition is a little bit dicey. But if you look at a definition that really reflects the way people live, which is basically what's the participation rate of people from, say, 25 to 60, we are actually relatively high by historic standards. We have much higher participation now than you would have seen, during the Reagan administration or any time in the 80s. We're in a macro trend, basically starting at before World War II, leading up to today, where we are in just a generally upward indication of higher participation rates. So it fluctuates a little bit. But are there workers who are discouraged and dropped out? Sure, but there always are. Are there more now than there used to be? No, there really aren't. So that doesn't hold up to scrutiny either. You hear people say Americans are just too lazy to work nowadays. Well, again, that's not true. I've been in higher ed long enough to hear multiple generations complain about the generations behind them. And so that's a constant trope that you hear. Well, these kids today, they just don't want to work. They're too entitled. Actually, I will tell you, so someone who works with millennials and young people, they are actually a pretty good group of workers. I'd hire a lot of the students. Now, I know I have a skewed view because I see the ones that are pursuing education, and mostly I see the ones who are pursuing education and business, which are going to tend to be your more serious students. But if you look at the statistics for this generation, they're good workers. They have good technological talent. They have good attitudes toward work. So I don't think there's any kind of indication that somehow Americans are lazier than they used to be. Again, I don't think, certainly it doesn't hold up to explaining why we're having a talent crunch. I hear the idea that there's a grand conspiracy to build a socialist welfare state in the US, and that the whole idea is to get people off of the working role and onto government dependence as some sort of way of changing our system of government. Again, I don't see any evidence to support that. These are all just political explanations that you'll hear people on the news shows yelling about and trying to get ratings on whipping people up. But none of these stand up to scrutiny in the real world in terms of explaining why it is that we're facing such a profound talent crunch. So is it the economy? Well, the economy actually is doing very well right now on most fronts. The US gross domestic product in 2021 grew by 5.7% compared to a decline of 3.4% in 2020. Now, why were we declining in 2020? Well, there were a couple of headwinds. One, we picked a couple of trade wars and then we lost them. We had pulled out of some trade agreements that were actually pretty beneficial to the US, and we had the early impacts of COVID. So there were just a lot of headwinds in 2020 that were hurting us. So if you go from a decline of 3.4% to an increase of 5.7, which is actually pretty high even by historic standards, that gives you, a swing of over 9%. So it's a pretty big recovery that we're having. Has happened pretty quickly. Specifically in the fourth quarter of 2021, the US gross domestic product grew at about 6.9%. If that were to continue, that would equate to an annualized rate of about 14.3%. So that's pretty substantial growth in the economy. In January alone of this year, the month that just ended, non-farm payroll grew by 467,000 people. More people were employed in January. Leisure and hospitality added 151,000 of those. Professional and business services added about 86,000. Retail, which is, you hear lots of stories about retail and decline, and certainly in some sectors it is, but they added 86,000. I'm of the belief that retail is less in decline than we've just gotten bad at it. I think we're just not very good at retail the way that we used to be. And then transportation and warehousing added about 54,000 jobs. In terms of market performance, which sometimes correlates with the real economy, oftentimes does not, but the markets have been up, volatile. They're flat right now, waiting for Fed action, anticipated action that the Federal Reserve is likely to increase interest rates. Which ones and exactly how much is, people are watching and trying to figure out that. Unemployment is low at about 4%. We consider anything in like 3.8 to be, and that's sort of 3.5 to 3.8 to be what we call frictional unemployment. So those are simply people changing jobs. So you never get to an actual zero. So in effect, 3.8 would be zero, and we're at 4. So the unemployment rate is very, very low. And you get people arguing, well, we're not very good at measuring unemployment, but actually we are. So that's a reliable figure in terms of that 4% is pretty accurate. Now, the other part of how the economy is doing is, of course, inflation, because nothing can douse a growth in GDP quite as quickly as inflation. If the economy is growing, but the dollars that you're getting at the end of the day are worth less than they were the day before, then that detracts from the value of the GDP growth. It's unclear. We're certainly experiencing inflation right now with 7.5% at this moment. That's the highest it's been in about 40 years. It's unclear if this is strictly a recovery phenomenon or long-term. Most people do not believe this is a long-term phenomenon, but we won't really know until we see how long it lasts, whether it is really long-term. So everyone, this is very much in the area of estimates and speculation, but it's unclear how long this inflation will continue and what effect the interest rate raises might have on this or on the economy. The Fed is always playing with the interest rates. If you lower them, it increases economic activity, but you run the risk of inflation. You lower them, you control inflation, but you can cause the economy to stall. So it's always a balancing act. So what impact does inflation have? Well, it depends on who you are. If you are a saver or an investor, generally speaking, inflation is bad for you, because the money you're investing, you have to try to get a return that is high enough to not only give you a reasonable return on the money, but also overcome the effects of inflation. So if I invest or save today, the money I withdraw or take in a dividend or capital gain tomorrow is going to be worth less than that dollar would be today. So for savers and investors, generally speaking, inflation is not your friend. For debtors, inflation is your friend. Because if you borrow money today and I'm going to pay it back over time going forward, the dollars that I'm paying back are worth less than the dollars I borrowed. And so inflation can be your friend. Many people who owned homes in the late 60s and maybe 1970 or so essentially had their houses paid for by inflation, because you no doubt recall that we had some very serious inflation in the 70s. I think for that decade, we averaged 6.8%, but that was varied. In 1974, it was over 11% inflation for that year. So just as an example, I reflect on my parents bought a house in 1970, and I come from a working class family. My dad was a mechanic, and they bought a house in 1970 in a small town in Alabama for $20,000. The payment was about $170 a month, and it was a real payment. Now, by about 1976, it had become kind of a non-deal because of inflation. The payment on the house remained the same, but of course, because of inflation, wages had to spiral. So my father, being a very financially cautious man, I'll say, insisted on not paying the house off. So he took his full 30 years to pay off that mortgage and made those payments every month. So they paid it off in 2000. So they kept their full 30-year mortgage, 30 years. He wasn't going to give up his $170 a month house payment and pay off the house early. He enjoyed that too much. But that's the effect, the kind of effect that inflation has on the debtor. It actually can be quite beneficial if you are a net debtor in terms of inflation. In terms of workers, it's a negative most of the time, because it's typical and difficult to have wages maintain the kind of upward mobility that is needed to adjust for inflation. So small levels of inflation are very manageable. We never have inflation at zero. Inflation is always with us. It's just when the rate starts to get higher, it's difficult for wages to keep up with the effect of inflation. So just give you an example, if you had gone back to 1974 and borrowed $1 and you owed that dollar back today, the dollar you'd be paying back today in 1974 dollars would be worth about 17 cents. So that gives you an idea of the effect of inflation over that period of time. So what has caused the great talent crunch? First, understand that this talent crunch existed before the pandemic. In February of 2020, before any effect of the pandemic, for every 100 job openings, there were 82 unemployed people. So we already had more jobs than we had people. Now that's obviously a generalization, and in specific fields, it can get much, much worse. Currently, there are about 65 unemployed workers for every 100 jobs that are available. So we are more in a talent crunch than we were. But in key fields where someone needs advanced training, anything related to medicine for the most part, certainly anything in that requires advanced degrees, engineering, many forms of engineering, anything related to computer technology, anything related to the law, the talent crunch is very profound. I will tell you, as a dean, trying to hire faculty right now is a nightmare to find people who have the credentials. In the field of accounting, for example, there are more people with PhDs in accounting retiring every year than there are new degrees being minted. So hiring in that field is the bane of my existence. It is very, very difficult to even find candidates with the credentials, and much less be the one that they happen to pick and be able to create the right package for them. So what's happening here? It is oftentimes presented in the media as a phenomenon of young workers, and part of the resignation is a phenomenon of young workers. But when they're talking about young, they're really talking about 30 to 45. So it depends on your definition of that's young to me, but it's still it depends your definition of young. But the bigger issue is baby boomers are aging out of the workforce. Now, we know from prior generations how this works in terms of proportions, but there have been a couple of things that happened that have affected the baby boomers' retirement patterns. One is the financial crisis that happened in the 2007, 2008 kind of financial crisis, the Lehman Brothers falling, the great beginning of the Great Recession. That is you sort of think about, this is the George W. Bush administration recession. They that people delayed retirement. They became very concerned about the economy. They delayed retirement. You can't underestimate the profound impact that Great Recession had on people's behavior on a number of fronts. We're actually going to talk about some other behavioral changes that came from that in just a moment. But baby boomers put off retirement. And again, when this economy, with the COVID the shutdown happened and that affected the economy, many baby boomers who would have retired did not. What you see is that kind of delayed retirement happening now. Baby boomers are aging out of the workforce very, very quickly. They're moving out of the workforce very quickly. This was always happening, and it was always going to be coming. If you've got people in your family who are coming into the job market now, the students that I work with in today's workforce have hit the demographic lottery. They're coming into the workforce at a time when baby boomers are retiring in huge numbers. So all they have to do is pick a city, move there, and they'll figure out what job they want and go see, and probably 10 baby boomers who had that job retired today, and they can come take it. So they can. This is a fantastic time to be starting a career, if you because I mean people are really just desperate to hire folks, and so younger people right now, this is a real opportunity. They're being able to move up in responsibility a lot faster than prior generations, just because this huge mass of baby boomers are ahead of them and retiring. The other issue is, and this is again no small part because of the Great Recession, is we see birth rates are declining. Now that's been a steady trend. People are having fewer kids, but there was a profound effect on people's decision to have children because of the Great Recession. This has created in higher education, in my world, what we generally refer to as the 2025 problem, which is historically, we graduate in the United States about 3.5 million kids a year from high school, and then some proportion of those go on to college. That's going to drop by 500,000 in 2025, which is basically this year's ninth graders. So the classes that are coming out of high school, they're already declining, but in 2025, they go over a cliff. And that is the reason, again, if you've got young people who are going to be applying to college in your family in the next few years, the chances are they're going to get in almost any place they apply, other than, the kind of the 15 schools that all consider themselves in the top 10. Those schools are going to remain competitive, but by and large, most institutions your students apply to, they're going to be admitted. They may or may not get the same level of financial aid, but they're certainly going to be admitted, because we are all fishing for students right now, because again, our population, we see them coming 18 years later, and this bounce, and so we kept expecting, okay, it's going to bounce back. People are going to move back to having kids, and these classes are going to recover. And I will tell you that to date, that has not happened. There was even talk about maybe there would be a baby boom coming out of the quarantine, because, people are at home. What else are they going to do? They even had a name picked out for it. They're going to call them quarantinis. These are going to be all the babies that are going to be born as a result of the quarantine. I have an elevated train track outside of my office window here, so if you're hearing a loud noise in the background, that's a train passing by. I apologize for that. But anyway, we had a name picked out. All these babies, we're going to call them quarantinis. We're going to be a baby boom coming out of the quarantine, and it, again, just has not happened. That people are not having babies in large numbers. You do see reduced targeted participation rates among certain young workers. Again, the main age group that seems to be from the younger workers that are dropping out of the workforce, like the 30 to 45. And that is, we'll talk about why that is in a few minutes, but largely it's, I think, people retooling and rethinking their work lives. We see, again, counter to what you will hear in the media, there's actually falling immigration rates, and we have not become serious about normalizing the status of workers who are in the United States. So again, as someone who spends my day in part trying to get a lot of young people placed into jobs, it is very frustrating when I run across a very talented student who's been in the United States for years and is not allowed to work because of our immigration policy. We're letting a lot of talent sit on the sideline. And by and large, we have reduced the number of immigrants coming into the United States at a time that we really need workers and we really need talent. So I know there are lots of reasons of sort of cultural and social and political reasons why people may oppose immigration, but from an economic standpoint, immigration is a positive. And so our failure to have, I think, a more effective immigration policy and a normalized status with workers is certainly costing us from an economic standpoint. At the same time that we have profound talent crunches in areas where there is there's lack of credentials, we've seen a corresponding decline in public investment in higher education. It is a little bit of a disconnect because of our particular system of government, because our trade and economic policy is mostly driven from a national standpoint, and investment in education is largely a state-by-state issue. So what would make sense would be to, as you sort of increase international trade, as you're more focused on economic growth nationally, is that you would invest more in education. We would want more people who were trained to code, more people who were engineers, more people who were who had more education. We're not seeing that. We're actually investing less publicly in higher education at a time that we need more people to be to have the benefits of higher education. And that would not, that's not a personalized thing. That would affect me. I'm in a private institution, but it would certainly, but our public investment in public universities is declining, unfortunately. We also have suffered, I think, through an issue of business models that have relied too heavily on subsidized labor. We've, you see either major employers, the Walmarts of the world, who have relied upon essentially public support for their employees, which allowed them to pay lower wages. And so the business models, I think, have not adjusted to the reality of what the power of labor now holds. And this is not, I don't necessarily mean unionized labor, just any labor. The idea that someone can walk off of a job and then easily replace that job means that you've got to be more competitive as an employer. I was spending some time with an entrepreneur who runs a series of gyms, fitness gyms. People come and work out. And he's having a very difficult time finding both trainers, but the more difficult issue is finding front desk staff, people just to do clerical office type work, to work the front desk, to greet people, to renew memberships, to talk people through memberships. The problem, he says, is that what he would normally be paying, which was $15 an hour, is now getting him the people who used to be working for $8 an hour. And he simply is not finding the talent that he needs. And it's difficult for him to sort of stick a crowbar in his thinking of how he's going to run his business, to think maybe I'm going to be paying my front desk staff $25 to $30 an hour instead of 15. And that's what we've got in business models. We have models that have been built on subsidized labor, and that subsidy, I think people are no longer willing to work those jobs. There's a fundamental rethink, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But we do have, I think, an antiquated business models built on unrealistically low labor costs. So where are all these people going? What's happening in terms of this resignation? What are they doing with themselves all day long? That's the question that people keep asking. I think is a very fair question. It's kind of a hard question to answer. But in context, in November of 2020, so 3 months ago, there were 4.5 million workers voluntarily left their job in the month of November. 4.5 million. Now, 40% of those were in the top industries, which sort of makes sense. But restaurant, hotel, travel, bar, warehouses, manufacturing, and healthcare. So that's not quite half of everybody was in. So that's over 2 million people though that were in those categories alone. Now you ask them why they resigned. The typical reasons they give are they were being asked to work erratic hours, they were dealing with rude customers, and they had a shortage of colleagues to help. Friends of mine in the restaurant business are very, very frustrated and very burned out. Restaurants are trying to operate with skeleton crews because they simply can't hire people. Well, of course, the impact of being short-staffed on the people who are working is incredible levels of burnout. And so you just wonder if it's sustainable for people to do that. Certainly here in Atlanta, I run across restaurants that are no longer open in the evening because they can't find enough people to work, or are closing 1 day a week. There's I did notice an ad that came out from one of my favorite pizza restaurants in Birmingham, and the ad said, "We will literally hire anybody. If you are unemployed and want to work, come see us. We will hire anybody." Now, I'm not sure, having been a patron there over the years, that's really a change in their hiring practices as much as maybe they're just being more honest about their hiring. It seems like they'd always hire pretty much anybody who walked in the door. But certainly right now, if you have any ability to work and you want to work, there's no reason you should not be working right now. So why are they leaving? What are they doing? Well, it seems to fall into some fairly predictable categories. Search for more meaning, higher pay, more respect from management. I think as people have choices, as workers have choices, they're gravitating away from drudgery. They're gravitating away from being treated poorly. They want higher pay. We've had no real wage increases in the United States for about 30 years. It has not been a great time for wages, especially for the non-college educated. There's been a bigger pay gap between people who were college educated and those who were not, and the jobs for people who are not college educated have not kept up in terms of salary and pay. There's more search for flexibility and alternative schedules, in terms of days, output versus face time. People are questioning, do you really need me there 5 days a week? Which I know sounds to the ear like, well, people are just being lazy, they want to work less. I think they just want to work smarter by and large. They want to work, do you need me? You need me to be here for FaceTime? Do I need to be sitting here 9 to 5, or can I get the job done and integrate it more with my life? And I think what we've seen from the pandemic is people come to realize, yeah, I can really integrate my life and my work life more effectively. So search for flexibility, alternative schedules, I think is a big part of it. Certainly caring for children. Childcare has always been an issue, but it's emerged as a particular issue during the pandemic as schools have been closed or school schedules have been erratic. People don't know their kids are going to get sent home because someone in the class has COVID and someone needs to be at home to help manage that. People are retooling for different industries or occupations. They're starting new businesses. There's a lot of business upstarts that have come out of this. People decide they want to go out on their own. And I think ultimately there's just a cultural fundamental rethink. We see so many people who have died because of COVID. People have become sick. There's a sense that life is precious and my life is short, and what am I going to do it? And am I going to spend the time on the job I hate, or am I going to retool and do something differently? So I do think you can't overlook the idea that there's some sort of fundamental rethink of the relationship between each of us and work that is going on as part of this pandemic. So how does it get turned around? Well, it's not going to, from the numbers I'm seeing, it's not going to turn around very quickly. It's certainly not. I don't think it's going to turn around this year. Part of what will help is real wage growth. Business models need to be built on realistic wages, and that probably the day of realistically employing large numbers of people at $7.35 an hour have passed. I don't know anyone's going to be able to get away with paying minimum wage in this market, and that's probably not going to come back. The balance of power between management and labor, certainly labor has the upper hand at the moment. If you're, again, an employee and it's fairly easy to replace your job, then management has to be more receptive and more open to how employees are treated. We do need a public policy focus on making good quality childcare available so that people who have children are not whiplashed in and out of the workforce based upon this effect, because we are going to have to, I think, long-term live with COVID-19 and its variants. Again, I'll say something that is potentially somewhat controversial, but I have at this point no patience for anyone who won't get vaccinated and are putting other people at risk. And so I do think that would never be in favor of forcing anyone to take the vaccine, but at the same time, I would be perfectly comfortable in saying you can't come to this work site or participate in these parts of public life. Can't come to the hospital, you can't go other places where you're going to be creating a problem for the larger community. If there's not some compelling reason you can't be vaccinated, then you've got to be vaccinated. I remember when I was I must have been in second or third grade, and the public health officials in my county came in, took us all, lined us up, jerked our sleeves off, shot us full of the smallpox vaccine, and left the permanent scar on our arm, and then sent us out to the playground to play. And nobody questioned it or argued about it. You just did it. You lined up, and they didn't ask you, hey, do you want this? They just did it. They just shoved the thing in your arm, go play kickball. And that was, I don't know why this particular vaccine has created so much consternation, but I think we need to find the fortitude of our most immediate public policy officials and say, you're gonna get vaccinated, or you're gonna essentially be excluded from large parts of public life. There's no excuse for letting, in my view, again, I'm editorializing now, I recognize, but to cut people, to allow people to put their fellow man in that kind of danger by not getting the vaccination. And then we also need a serious policy to normalize the status of immigrant labor. If you're in the United States, you should be able to work legally, figure out how to do that. No one's suggesting that you throw the borders open, but we do, if you want talent, you got to either birth it, which we're not doing, or you got to let it in from the outside, which we're not doing. And so, I still, strangely enough, hear people say, well, immigrants are coming in and taking jobs away from Americans. No one's taking jobs away from Americans because no one's taking jobs. We only have, again, 65 people for every 100 opening. So we need talent, and we need bodies. So we need people paying into the Social Security system. We need people participating in the labor force. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that part of the labor issues in many states, certainly in Alabama, and also I think Georgia would be much different, is not just finding employees, but finding sober employees. So we do need to make sure that we have a public policy that tries to discourage the use of illegal drugs, and perhaps reforming marijuana laws or things that don't take people unnecessarily out of the workforce. In the state of Alabama, where I was a dean up until about 6 months ago, for skilled and semi-skilled manufacturing jobs, up to 80% of applicants in any given job opening will fail simple drug screening. So you have, if you finished high school, did not go to college, and you're in the state of Alabama and you apply for a skilled or semi-skilled manufacturing jobs, 8 out of 10, 80% of the applicants fail simple drug screening. Now, we don't know offhand how many of those are smoking marijuana versus something more insidious in terms of the drugs, but we do know that there are large parts of the population that are being excluded from the job market because of drugs. So public policy that addresses the drug use and access to drugs has an economic impact as well. And I'm not against drug testing. I mean, if you're going to operate a multi-million-dollar piece of equipment, I don't think it's unreasonable for your employer to want you to be sober to do that. That seems like a reasonable expectation, but I do think we need to look at why the drug use is high, why people are failing, and what we can do to get more of those people back into the workforce. All right, so that is those are my thoughts. That's what we know about this. When will it be over? Now you're getting into the area of speculation, but I don't believe that you're going to see a reversal of this talent crunch in this year. I think you'll see perhaps more normalization going into the next year. But again, this is a generational coming and a generational talent crunch. And until we take actions to try to deal with it along some of the lines that I just described, I'm not sure this talent crunch is going to go away. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then let people who want to unmute ask questions.
I have a comment or sort of a question, and it pertains to an article I was reading yesterday in the New York Times, the title of which I think says it all: The Grueling Life of a Truck Driver, which firmly convinced me I made the right decision in not choosing truck driving for a living. And I note here that there's a comment, and I have seen in the news how we have this serious shortage of truck drivers in the country. It says that the average trucking company has a turnover rate of 95%, and it can't replace these drivers fast enough. But there's a comment in here, a note by Steve Viselli, a labor expert at the University of Pennsylvania, who previously worked as a truck driver, who said this shortage narrative is industry lobbying rhetoric. There is no shortage of truck drivers; they are just really bad jobs. Uh, is this a common problem here? I guess with maybe some other jobs that are not so desirable. Like, as I said, after reading this article, I realized that truck driving is a tough job.
It is a tough job, and it's hard. I've never been a truck driver myself, although that was always one of my, what if I don't do this? What's the next gig? Maybe be a truck driver. The other thing that you have to be concerned about if you were going to be a young person decide to be a truck driver is it appears that the automation of trucks is probably ahead of the automation of automobiles. And so if you really did reach a point where you had self-driving trucks, that would there are a lot of truck drivers, and those opportunities might not be there. But it is an entire package of what's being offered, and you do hear stories of incredibly long hours, unreasonable expectations. They put devices on the truck, so we're going to catch you if you're speeding and get you in trouble, but we also expect you to get from point A to point B in probably what is an unreasonable time frame. And it's I can't imagine that is a particularly easy life. But again, if you've got in every labor market, you've got the new entrants that are oftentimes privileged. You have Mercedes comes into Alabama, and Mercedes does not have a difficult time hiring. They're going to do fine. They've got good conditions. They've the wages are solid. It's kind of the exciting company to work for. But all the people that they hire used to work someplace else, and so it's the backfill there. So maybe you create a trucking company, you take good care of your workers, you compensate them. Workers will gravitate there, but you're going to be taking those truck drivers away from 5 other companies that maybe you're not in a position because of the way they built their financial model to do that, or just their disposition is not to treat their drivers as well. And yeah, they're going to, the drivers are in the driver's seat, so to speak, in terms of employment.
Could you elaborate on the term subsidized labor? I'm not familiar with that, and it implies to me that somebody's paying my workers other than me. So how does subsidized labor work?
Sure. Subsidized labor, if you look at an employer like Walmart, and Walmart has worked to try to reform their labor practices, but there are a significant number of Walmart employees that are also on public assistance of one sort or another, whether it's their children receiving free meals in school, or they're on not only on wages, but also having other kinds of subsidies. Or if you are not providing health insurance and your employees are essentially riding on the system where they're going into the emergency room for things they ought to be seeing a regular doctor for, which drives up all of our costs, and we then, as people who are insured and other consumers of medical services, end up picking up those costs. So it'd be the equivalent of if you built if you had 2 manufacturing plants that are both building the same thing, and one of them is cleaning the water and releasing it, and the other is releasing polluted water into the river. Well, you would imagine that the costs of the people who are letting the polluted water out are lower, so they're competing head to head. It gives them an advantage. but we then have to come back as the public and clean up the river. And in economics, we call those externalities. So these are external costs, and public policy really ought to be about taking those externalities and forcing them back onto the company. That is, you should have to pay your full cost. Well, if you're paying someone minimum wage and not providing them any kind of benefits or health insurance, then you're not covering the full cost of that person, and that's going to, in about a dozen different ways, going to be foisted onto the public. So if you want efficient markets, if you want the businesses that are good to survive, and you want the businesses that are bad to not survive, and so other people can take over those resources and do good things with them, the classic idea of the invisible hand of the market. If you believe in efficient markets, then we should have public policy that foists those externalities back onto the employers. So if you employ someone, you should be responsible for the full cost of employing that person. And if you're paying a minimum wage and not providing any kind of benefits, you're essentially—
What did I do? I just
cost
touched
on
it.
the
I don't
public.
know what.
Interesting question.
What did you touch, sweetie?
Touch this.
Okay.
If you were going to create a child care policy,
Good.
how would you do it? And I asked that because I saw an article that talked about what countries spend on child care.
Sure.
And a lot of the European nations are spending $20,000 to $30,000 a year per child in child care. That sounds like a lot.
How to get out of that?
So how does child care policy work as far as who pays for it? The person that talked to us, I think from the Latino community, was real big on that, and it wouldn't be that the employer would have to pay for the child care policy. It would be a federal thing. It'd be national. What would that cost?
That is, you're asking me a question that is way outside my area of expertise, and so I really couldn't give you an effective answer in terms of what it would cost. I will say that it would be the economic benefits would be obvious. I mean, people talk about universal pre-K, so that these students would be starting into public education as pre-K, as opposed to starting in the first grade. Other kinds of tax incentives, the way that we support, say, home ownership historically through the tax codes. That would be the other, I think, policy levers that you would want to pull. In terms of what that costs, that's way outside of my area of expertise. And I think,
But it would have to be a national program as opposed to individual or local programs.
I would think it'd be a combination of the two, but sure, I think if you're talking about tax policy, obviously that's going to be a national policy.
Stephen, I can assure you that people who are living in the Washington, D.C. area spend $20,000 to $30,000 privately in order to get child care. So that number, while it seems ridiculously high, really is kind of a baseline. And one problem is that the industry has underpaid its employees, and there's great turnover, and finding good childcare is very difficult unless you spend a lot of money.
I believe it, having lived in Washington with young kids myself. I can't tell you offhand what we spent, but it seemed like a lot at the time. So that number probably not unrealistic. All right, now Dennis has his hand up as being very well behaved, as you know.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. I had a question about the impact of immigration on employment in the United States. And I think, as I look at it, there's really two factors at work here. One is at the southern border, we've got an influx of people for humanitarian reasons who want to get into the United States, and perhaps they have less training and less language skills. But there's another source of immigration that in the past we've had more of, and that's from Europe and from Asia. The kids who would come to college, become postdocs, some of whom would come over and work as maids or healthcare providers to senior citizens who need help as a domestic aid. And that's been kind of turned off as well, I think. Is there a reason we couldn't turn at least that part of it back up non-controversially? Because I know there's a lot of politics involved in both of those things.
Sure, there is a great deal of politics. I mean, some of that I think goes straight back to COVID. I think we've all seen it's been difficult for international students to travel to the United States and concerned that once they were here, they'd not be able to get back home. And so we've seen a decrease in of international students wanting to come to the United States to study as a public health issue. I think part of that is just going to be a matter of getting control of COVID, getting vaccination rates as high as humanly possible, and see if we can get some control of these variants. But no, it's across the board in terms of talent levels. We need an immigration policy, ideally, that encourages people with high technical skills who are largely not going to come across the southern border, but are probably just going to fly into an airport near you, and that's the larger source of immigration. And even on the southern border, you do hear lots of gnashing of teeth about the size of the numbers of the people arriving, but in terms of those that are sort of welcome, normalized, brought in the U.S. and allowed to join the workforce, that number is declined.
Yeah. I was going to say that I've done some work with the ones coming in. They're coming from everywhere, from Syria, from the south of the border, and these are kids. And they come here to go to school. One of them, I know, wanted to be a doctor, and he's not allowed to work for 3 years, and he's going to get himself into drugs. And he is a sitting duck for the drug trade taking him over because he can't drive a car, he's not allowed to drive, and he's not allowed to work, and he'll never make it to medical school. And it just makes me angry.
Yeah, it does me as well. And we have that with students who are right here at college right now that are not allowed to work. Now, what ends up happening,
or drive or marry.
Right. Well, what happens is that large people it's not that they're not participating in the economy. They are, but they're participating in the gray economy or the black market economy, or in the best case scenario, building businesses that may be in somebody else's name, but they're really the ones running it. We are missing a lot of opportunities by not normalizing, and some of these are kids who've been in the United States since they were babies,
right?
And don't know any other world, and so it's just we're behaving irrationally in terms of immigration right now. Certainly, again, there are lots of reasons why people might oppose immigration that have nothing to do with economics, and I hear that. But from that's my whole lens is looking at the market, and from the market and from the business standpoint, we need to reform immigration to make it easier for people to come here and work, especially people that have the talents that we are so lacking bodies in.
Yeah, good question. Being a business school, what is your position? Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, what is your position regarding teaching your students as far as a living wage, or as far as responsibilities to societies? Are you teaching your students that the whole purpose of business is just to make a profit, regardless, and no responsibility to the community? What is the approach now in business schools?
I think you'd be hard pressed to finding anyone in business school that's teaching that. I mean, we present, all right, here's Milton Friedman, 1972. The purpose of business is to make money. Period. We of course we talk about this debate, but the debate, I think, in realistically is effectively over. You can't you cannot run a business purely for profit today, because you think there's a talent crunch generally. If you're not reflecting the values that employees want to have among their employers, they want their employers to reflect their values. If you're not doing that, you think there's a talent crunch. Boy, there's a huge talent crunch. you give one of our students the opportunity to go to work for a company they can really believe in the values of the company, or one they don't, they're not staying at the one that does. Maybe they'll maybe take the first job, but you're not going to be able to keep and retain employees if you're not reflecting their values. And this is a generation, young workers right now, particularly, that they care about those kinds of issues.
Right. So isn't that part of the problem of the labor crunch?
It's part of individual companies' labor crunch. We have we're sort of a shortage of labor, but you want to try to hire and your values don't reflect the larger values. It's going to make it of your workers. It's going to make it very, very difficult to hire and retain people. And so I don't know any companies right now that aren't focused on their role as contributors to society. I think the whole Milton Friedman argument has largely been lost. There's a larger purpose to business than simply to make money.
Have you seen any data that would affect your predictions or plans about the effect of long-term COVID? There was an article recently that said there are something like 1.5 million people out of work because of it. And I thought that was ridiculous. And then I looked up the numbers, and it turns out something like 49% of women and 37% of men have long-term COVID. And I thought it was just a tiny fraction of people. And I don't think they know how long it's going to last.
Yeah, that's really getting out of my area of expertise. I do know that the number you quoted in terms of the number of people who are absent because of COVID related is accurate. There's a substantial number of people still who are missing work on any given week because of COVID related issues. Now, what we've seen anecdotally and what the data does seem to suggest is that if you're vaccinated, the current COVID is not a big deal. It's a big deal, but it's not the death sentence that it is if you're non-vaccinated. And so that seems to be where it is. I mean, we've had, I'm at a private institution now, so we can effectively compel students and faculty and staff to be vaccinated, and our rate of cases on campus has been tiny. My colleagues at public institutions where they're not able to do that, it's been different. So whether you're missing because you personally have COVID, you have a family member with COVID shut down your kid's school and the kid's got to be home, you've got to be home to watch the kids, whatever it is, that the COVID absenteeism related to COVID is still very, very high. In terms of how long that'll last and the effect of long-term COVID, that's way out of my area of expertise.
Would it make sense to have a national program which would in effect require the payment of a minimum living wage, but will be adjusted for local cost, which should shift the cost of the externalities onto the larger population that's buying the products and services, and relieve the government of the problem of trying to come up with programs that address specific issues, many times not as effectively as a broader put money in the pocket program would do.
Sure, I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a federal minimum wage, and then adjusting it for local circumstances. I think is absolutely fine. I don't know that I have a dollar figure. I mean, everyone talks about $15 an hour, which seems like as reasonable number as any to me. But understand though that adjusting that is not necessarily going to immediately solve this talent crunch. It doesn't create more bodies. I think you might get a few more people off the sidelines, but by and large, that's going to improve the lives of those workers, but it's not going to solve the talent crunch, fixing minimum wage. But I think having a minimum wage is perfectly reasonable. And in the case of public employees at the federal level, they have a system for adjusting wages based upon locality. So if you're a federal employee and you transfer from an office in DC to an office in Peoria, you're going to make less money because there is some adjustment already built in. So we already know how to do that kind of adjustment. So having that be part of the minimum wage, sure, that would be perfectly reasonable. But by and large, as long as we're in this talent crunch, I think the demand is going to force many of those employers to pay. So holding the line right now to try to pay, I think minimum wage is what, $7.35. Trying to pay $7.35 right now is probably a fool's errand in terms of a business model. And not to be too cynical about it, but if that's where you are, it just probably means you're bad at your business, and you need to relinquish those assets and let somebody who knows how to do it take over, because that's not a sustainable model in terms of relying upon building your model around those artificially low labor costs. Is just not a long-term solution.
Will it change to have the people who have people work less than 20 hours or less than 30 hours a week so they don't have to pay benefits? Is that changing?
That has the number of people who are forcibly part-time employed have gone down. There's still people who would like to be full-time that are part-time, but those numbers have been declining. Again, largely because of, if you want a full-time job, generally you can go get it. Also, if you're experiencing this talent crunch, from what I'm seeing anecdotally, I think people are working their employees more hours, not fewer. So if you've got someone who's willing to work, and you can, maybe you're expanding their hours out, as opposed to trying to find, if you can't find people to work, you got to work the people you have more hours. But yeah, there are numbers that came out for fourth quarter of last year, and the number of people who would like to be employed full-time or actually employed part-time has decreased. Which is what you would expect.
Any other questions? Well, we thank you very much, Dr. Kraft, for coming to us on Zoom and enlightening us on some things we didn't think about or things we didn't know about the situation.
Happy to do. Always happy to be here. It's great to see you guys.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry you're not still in Birmingham, but I gather you moved several months ago. This is Janice